Welcome to this panel discussion on missing perspectives. At a time when diversity and inclusivity have become buzzwords embraced by corporations and to institutions to entrepreneurs, we still find several perspectives missing from our many narratives. Join Deepika Shrivastava, Eve McNeil and Yarden Levy as they highlight some of these perspectives by focusing on gender and design practice, the non-elite or pop culture, and the question of value in the culture section. They also question what is missing from the seemingly all-inclusive term global. I'm going to do a brief introduction of each of our panelists and the research they have been engaged with. We will then discuss some pre-arranged questions and go into the Q&A for the last 10 to 15 minutes. Please do place any questions that you may have in the chat throughout the discussion, and these will be read out during the Q&A section. So let's introduce our panelists. Deepika's work on the MA focuses on how contemporary architecture practice in India can be studied through the lens of its day-to-day operations and the aspect of collaboration inherent within design production. She's a storyteller at heart, and for her, design history is a lens to understand the world one design at a time. Eve's research focuses on popular culture and its place, or sometimes lack of place, within museums and archives. Her research on the MA has been particularly focused on pop music and its related ephemera, and her dissertation considers how fan communities can be engaged and represented in museum projects related to pop music. Yarden's research focuses on gendering of the fashion education. In her research, she asks how fashion design education is designing the ideal student through the fashion industry's gendered ideals. She wishes to demystify the designer as the sole creator of fashion myth, and as this designer is often male. It is clear to see that there are a lot of perspectives that are not given space in our stories and histories about design culture. How did you locate missing perspectives in your work, and what techniques did you use to research and uncover these missing perspectives and give them a voice? Yarden, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So in my case, I found the missing perspective through my personal experience. I'm a fashion design graduate, and during my studies, I felt two main things. One is that I was tracked to be a certain kind of designer, and this ideal designer was not meant to be me. And two, I felt that me and all other women students were marginalized in a way, even though we were the outstanding majority of students. While there is a prolific discourse about how fashion is gendering the consumer, there is rarely a discourse about the gendering of fashion designers, and that's the perspective I was missing. And by gendering, I mean tracking them to be this genius, tortured artist, workaholic, visionaire, as all these traits are gendered, usually towards the male scale on the gender spectrum. Some of them are manifesting great autonomy or authorship, and some are embodying a lack of social life. Not really what the patriarchy wants from us. The technique I found most helpful when I was gathering a new body of oral history based on the student and staff interviews from the school I am researching. I chose the students quite randomly because I didn't want to really use pre-made articles or interviews with designers who graduated from the school, because I was afraid because of their success, they already complied with these ideals and wouldn't necessarily have the critical thinking that someone else would have had. So that's my missing perspective.
That's wonderful. Deepika, would you like to go next? I think Deepika's just having some technical difficulties. Eve, would you like to go next?
Sure, no problem. So my dissertation, I suppose, looked at the missing perspective of fans or cultural consumers within the field of pop music. And I suppose I kind of identified that missing perspective just from looking at the major pop culture or music exhibitions that have dominated museums in the last few years. And I saw a real focus on the performer or the director as a kind of sole designer, without much of an inclusion of the perspective of the fans or the communities of material culture that are built around these designers and actually play a huge part in making them meaningful. And so then this kind of included a recognition of the kinds of class structures and cultural hierarchies that are kind of at play there, and the fact that some cultural production is seen as more intellectually worthy than others, and within that some perspectives more worthy than others, meaning that the contributions of non-professional and non-academic communities, which often kind of crosses over with working class communities, isn't always recognised. So that was something that I suppose that was the missing perspective that I wanted to explore in my own research on pop music and its related material culture. And I think really similarly to Yarden, oral histories were a really big part of the kind of tools that I implemented here. My research was pretty much structured around an oral history approach, interviewing 10 different people who were either fans and collectors of pop music and memorabilia, or curators that had interacted with these fan groups. And so I feel that oral histories were really great in terms of really directly getting the voices on record without kind of having to search the archives that are obviously more skewed, and it involves just less of a direct story from the people who have experienced it. And then I think also just thinking of archives in a slightly alternative way, looking at non-conventional archives was really useful for me, because some of those experiences that are missing aren't always documented in a more traditional archive.
That's really interesting. Deepika, how have you found it?
I think firstly, I'll apologize that I had vanished and I then came. I had a bit of a net issue. I found my missing perspective, I think similar to Yarden, from my own personal experiences. I have undergraduate education in interior design in a school which has architecture, urban planning, and civil engineering, these kind of disciplines too. And when I was there, and also the fact that just 3% of the world's buildings are designed by architects, and I wondered about this gap. And I also when we write about architecture, and though the landscape is changing today, but when we profile architects in media depictions, the focus is on the star architect. Even still, when we profile individual works of architects, the monograph is the most popular format, and that format still glorifies one architect, and I wanted to move away from that. And so in my dissertation, it focused on one architectural practice in Mumbai, which is led by a woman. And yes, that was also a conscious choice. That is also a missing perspective, despite so many women, like in architecture schools at education level, the 50% women and 50% men, but by the time they graduate and they establish practices, it is mostly men. And so I had all these so many questions in mind, and I wanted to see what I can do to present a more cohesive, to present architecture as a collaborative practice, which is not just dependent on one architect. And that's what I was trying to do. So I focused on that, and in my dissertation, I actually focused on 4 strands. So one is to profile the practice. I thought, what can we do? What are the networks of practice? So I studied their geographical location. So they are based in Mumbai, which is a global city, which is India's commercial capital. And what advantage did that give them? I wrote about that. Then I also tried to profile their network of collaborators, like who are they consulting with, what are their clients like, and what is the media coverage like. And it's a very well profiled practice, so that gave me an advantage. And I tried to and yeah, I think that's what I did, and I tried to build a narrative out of it. And so yeah, that's how I located the missing perspective. Actually, going back to your question, that through my own observation, self-reflective attitude, and also my own identity, because I think that has been quite formative in locating this. And I also focused on interviewing techniques a lot. It couldn't have happened without oral history in my case too. And in this case of missing perspective, what is also important is who we interview. So I interviewed the design directors, not the principal architect, which is again that in a practice, the principal architect is interviewed. So I tried to address the missing perspectives like this.
So let's take a step back. Like, you've all mentioned about missing perspectives, obviously. So who gets to decide what perspectives and experience are dominant in our history, in any history? Why is it that some narratives are more commonly focused on whilst others are ignored? Eve, would you like to start us off on this?
Sure, yeah, I think that's a really big question, obviously. I think that the dominant narratives that we find in design history and in museum work are very similar to the dominant narratives that obviously control media and lots of other aspects of our lives. You know, there is a kind of white, Western, middle class, male domination of so many narratives in the media. But I think more specifically, historians of visual and material culture have also been influenced by this kind of long history of a kind of art historical approach, maybe a kind of traditional, Giorgio Vasari being the kind of original art historian, this approach of taking these kind of individual geniuses and really privileging their perspectives. I think design history is obviously, as a discipline, is really formed to try and move away from that. But I think that obviously that kind of unequal weighting is something that, you know, we're constantly working on.
And Yarden, how? I saw you nodding quite a lot during that. How would you like to add in?
I obviously agree with everything Eve said, and something that I want to build up on, also something that Anna said in the previous panel, if for anyone who was there, that yes, design history is trying to move away from this iconic image of the first so-and-so, but design historians research not only design historians. So in my case, when I research fashion students, I need to see which histories they are told, what they hear, who's the first fashion designer. Because when I studied fashion design, I studied that the first fashion designer was Charles Frederick Worth. Even though I studied in Israel, in a Middle Eastern country, I still learned that he was the first designer. And what made him the first designer? The fact that he wrote his name on things. Was there no one else in the world who did that before him? So these kind of questions that we know to ask as design historians are not fed to everyone that we research. So I think when we do research design history, we need to have that in mind. And another thing we need to have in mind is that our perspective also missing other perspectives, because we are here today. I'm going to speak for myself. I am a student studying in an established, expensive university, having this beautiful platform to speak in, but I'm speaking not in my own language. I speak in a language that is not of my own culture, that some people will not understand, or some people will not have the platform to talk about those kind of things. And they probably have different perspectives from what I have. And that's the fault of canonical histories, that they don't take history as parallel lines. They take history as a linear timeline of things that happened, but it's just not true. And inside those parallel lines lying a lot of missing perspectives that we ourselves also miss. So when we talk about diversity all the time, it's not just to have more people of color on Instagram. It's because we do miss perspectives all the time, all of us, because we basically cannot have all perspectives in the world. So yeah.
That was really well said. Deepika, how have you found these times?
I firstly would like to say that I agree with every word Yarden said, and I think she totally speaks my mind. And like, we have had a lot of discussions about this. And the one thing I would like to add is it's a question of power, who gets to decide the dominant narrative. And I agree with her that we both are in a place of privilege, that we're able to talk at this platform, and that gives the power. And like, we are bringing a missing perspective, but yes, we are missing out so many other perspectives. And also it has to do with one's, I think these kind of things, it has to do with one's upbringing and their own personal experiences and how they reflect on things. I think that is very crucial in shaping who identifies a missing perspective. I think in our case, we could identify these perspectives because we went through that. And there's this quote that you cannot change anything until you face it. So I think it really stands true for how missing perspectives can be identified, and also speaks of why some perspectives are missed.
No, that's really excellent. So how can we communicate these missing perspectives to the public? How do we ensure that the experiences aren't lost in translation, so to speak? Deepika, I'm going back to you for this one to start with.
So I'll say that I consider a design historian as a mediator between the public and the designer. And when here I say public, I'm talking about all kinds of public facing mediums, from exhibitions to social media or to journalistic writing or films, everything. And we are a facilitator of conversations. So I think one key thing when we are communicating these perspectives is we need to recognize that the process is cyclical. And also I think and to ensure and to help the fact that they're not lost in translation, maybe we can keep the person whose perspective we are communicating as an equal stakeholder in this perspective. So for example, in my case, if I have written a dissertation about SJK architects, I've profiled their networks, they should have ideally been an equal stakeholder in. And also what else we can do is, how do we communicate is, this is very intangible and the topic is intangible. So I think this is maybe a fine thing to say, but I think it's finding a balance between, understanding and even respecting that your audience is more aware of the dominant culture, and that this new perspective might be a bit difficult or hard for them to even accept at first. So the person who's presenting the missing perspective needs to be very flexible and needs to be an excellent facilitator. I think that's how we can communicate perspectives and ensure that they are not lost in translation. I realize I haven't really said a lot about how they communicate, but I think these things, they cover some bits of the question.
No, I love that comment about the facilitator of conversation. And Eve, would you like to expand on that maybe?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I wrote down in my thoughts for this, the first thing I wrote down was being a facilitator as well. So we're obviously thinking along similar lines. And yeah, I think I agree that the key is the, curator or the researcher seeing themselves as a facilitator of providing a platform. I think especially if the researcher or curator isn't part of this community of which the perspective is missing, I think even more so then, that person really needs to step back and act as someone who is providing a platform for someone else's narrative. And I think that that's something that has come up a lot in my work a little bit. Obviously, I've kind of looked at popular culture, and that's the term I tend to use for it. But I definitely struggled with the questions surrounding the fact that popular culture is inherently tied to kind of working class cultures or like non-affluent cultures. And as a person in a privileged position here, how could I kind of tell those stories about those cultures and those design products while recognizing, the contribution from those kind of communities without maybe being part of it myself. So that's a bit of a rambling answer, but yeah, I think it is to do with just kind of providing a platform. And I really like what Deepika said about being kind of equal stakeholders and working very collaboratively there on that kind of narrative.
No, that's really interesting. Jordan, would you like to?
Sure. I think part of working on this collaborative process, and as design historians, as mediators of this kind of, I think it's important for us when we are doing when we are facing the public and we are doing public practice, to let people know that they probably most of them in some way are part of missing perspectives. Because I'm giving a very real life example of fashion. Every time I talk to a man about the fact that I'm studying, that I used to study fashion design or that I worked in fashion, their immediate response is like, I don't know anything about fashion. And it's like, you choose your clothes in the morning, so you know something about fashion, and the fashion that you see on the runway is excluding you from the discourse on fashion, and it is yours as much as it's everyone else's. So like the t-shirt you bought in H&M has probably more impact on this world than something that walked on the runway. So I think letting people know that they're part of a process and they're not considered in it, it's something that can do kind of like a shift for people to be more involved in rewriting histories, because it's just, they can add more to the story.
Yeah, that's really interesting to like heighten other people's awareness when they say, oh, I don't know anything about that. That's really interesting. We've touched on this briefly before, but histories are told through lone stories or singular figures put on pedestals. How can researchers break away from this narrative to encompass the social and collaborative aspects and nature of design? Jordan, I'm going to come back to you for this one, because I know that your research is kind of directly pushing against this as well.
Yeah, I think we raised it in a lot of what we said, that the first step towards this is kind of like dismantling this idea that a creator of any kind works by themselves. It's something that is very prominent kind of in every creative or artistic field, that there is this image of something that doesn't really exist, because even if I bake a bread at home, I had to get the flour from somewhere, I had to buy the oven, I had to do so many things. So nothing that we create in this world that we live in now is our own private work. definitely not a designer that works in a studio with many other designers who probably did most of the work, and they're just saying yes or no to things. So I think, sorry, I kind of was in the moment, but I I just think that the biggest part of changing this is letting people know how important they are in the creative process, and how things are created because of society and because of people. And yeah, and just dismantle this idea that there is like people that have agency on everything, because it's just not true. We all have agency on design, on everything, because it's just such a big part of our lives. And the person who buy a chair, I think, design it as much as the designer design it, because if those chairs won't be bought, they wouldn't be designed for like the next collection of this chair shop. So that's in itself is a process of design, and that is a way in which we can move to a more collaborative future of designers and consumers and mediators and producers.
No, that was wonderful. Deepika, would you like to carry on with that?
Yeah, I agree with Yarden, and I think a lot of which design history, we talk about it as a public facing practice, and a lot of the public facing work happens in exhibitions, and it happens in media. And I think maybe if we can bring these other stakeholders more in the conversation, we can move towards a more inclusive story. And I think, like, even picking up from Eve's dissertation, which is about pop culture and music memorabilia, and she's actually putting the people who collect pop culture as I think she argued about them about being curators. I think that's also a very key point, and I think this is how inclusive. These are the missing perspectives which need to come more in design and design history.
No, that's good. Eve?
Yeah, I this is definitely something that was really relevant and really key theme of my whole dissertation project. I mean, obviously it really feeds into the specific discussions I was having about fandom, are really kind of about cultural consumption and the ways in which anyone who consumes cultural design is playing a part in making the meaning of that design, in the most basic terms of the fact that kind of as Yarden said, like if a piece of clothing or a chair or even in my case a record, if they don't sell and if they're not used and worn and displayed by people, then they don't become prominent pieces of design. And so I think just having the stories of the people who are the people that are hands-on engaging with the products, and then the kind of continuing life stories of the objects themselves post production is really interesting, and something that isn't or hasn't historically been explored much in our writings on material culture. And I researched a lot about different models of co-curation or kind of crowdsourced work that museums can participate in. And I think that this is really something that's opening up a really interesting future for co-curated projects, where, for example, something like the Design Museum's crowdsourced wall is quite a prominent part of their permanent gallery. Instead of kind of inviting designers to submit objects to make up this display as you initially go into their gallery, instead they invited the public to submit any objects that they thought were excellent examples of design or that had kind of enriched their view of design. And so I think just in terms of practical examples, projects like that have a lot of potential for that kind of model, I think, to be used and copied across all sorts of different exhibitions and projects about lots of different stories, really.
No, that's a great great answer. Thank you. Sorry, I was distracted by a question in chat. Yeah, please, we are going to open this up now for question and answer session. So please do feel free to place any questions in the chat room. As chair, I'm going to take the privilege of asking the first question. So we wanted to discuss maybe the term global in missing perspectives, and you know, how do we address this idea of global when there's so many missing perspectives in the terminology? It's often global north or Euro-American centric ideals or histories being told. So how can they become more inclusive, I suppose, is what I'm trying to ask. If anybody wants to start on this one.
I can start on this one. I think in this project we use the word global because we found that every other term just kind of obliterate every other country that is not going through those kind of dichotomies. I even have a problem with global south and global north because of where I'm coming from, which is technically in the global north and is diagnosed as a European country, which I'm sure, like, I'm from European descent, but I'm sure for other Israelis that are not from European descent, it could not be the truth. So I feel that in any dichotomy, it's always kind of looking to the West and or Europe and trying to compare yourself to it. So it's non-European, non-Western, global North, global South. And that's why we wanted to use the term global, because that it's not this or the other. It's just one big bowl that you can pick where you want to research. But yeah, that's why we use that term.
No, thank you. Ben Powell asks a really good question. How do we go about broadening our own lenses to find out and understand the intersectionality of those missing perspectives in the ongoing of our daily lives? So
I think firstly, we should keep our eyes more open and be more perceptive and receptive of what's happening around us. I think that can be a good start. And and also reading across different disciplines. I think that really helps to understand what that's a very good way of broadening your idea. So if I'm focusing on architecture, I would love to read about what economists or sociologists write about architecture. What is it that they're saying? And that really informs how I try to broaden my approach. And having different experiences, I think that's also very important.
Yeah, I mean, following on from that, I think that's something that this course has really taught me, is that obviously exhibitions themselves or archives or or any public facing work like that can be excellent tools to broaden our horizons as well. But kind of on the flip side, I think this course has really taught me to be critical in the sense of, when reading any kind of history book or documentary or going to an exhibition, obviously like enjoying the content that's there, but kind of thinking about what stories aren't there as well. I know in the last panel discussion, Fleur spoke a lot about this kind of negative space. And so I think that's just useful to kind of always question these kind of culture, this kind of media, and think about what people aren't represented there.
I think also part of broadening our ideas and thinking about intersectionality is just always having in mind that the way we read things, the way we perceive things, the way we enjoy or not enjoy things is personal, and other people have different narratives. And just going back to what Eve said about like when you read something you can enjoy it, but it's always important to kind of question it and be like, let's see who says something else, because that might not be the truth. So that's something we do talk a lot about in history of design, especially when we write our historiography essay, and we try to bring in different debates that talk about the same aspect or the same design from just many different angles. So always think the person you're reading is wrong. No, I'm kidding, but always look for the missing perspective.
Oh, wonderful. Jordan asks, you have all worked on research that has allowed you to interview those who are involved in your subject study, which really helps uncover the hidden perspectives. How do you find their reactions to your interest in their work? Were they or you surprised by the things that came up in the process of interviewing?
I think I can take this up. I don't mind. Yeah, I think they were really surprised, and I think one struggle I faced with the interview is that I was trying to interview architects who are not the principal architect, but they are design leads in this particular firm. And I was asking questions about, how, how does being in Mumbai affect your process? Who are the different collaborators, and how does that affect? So I was asking these kind of questions, and what they expected me to ask is, what are the different design elements in that in a particular building? And I think there was this. I won't say dichotomy or not even miscommunication, but I think there was this gap I faced that, what I'm trying to do is a little unknown. And I think now in digital, at the time I felt that they are not maybe that open to it, but now I feel that they were open to it, but I think they were just not used to being asked these kind of questions. And of course, me meeting them only online, that of course would have affected. So I think, yeah, I think it's like they are surprised, but I think we need to give them time to receive as well.
No, that's wonderful.
Oh, sorry.
No, carry on.
No, I was just going to say that I think I had a similar experience with interviewing subjects to my oral history research, was that they obviously, based on the kind of thing I was researching, they were very surprised to be asked these questions. I think, they were kind of like, oh, you're writing an MA dissertation and you want to write it about us. They seemed quite flattered but surprised that they'd be included in that kind of material. I think because they certainly were used to being seen as, these kind of slightly anarchy obsessives that collected all these different posters and records and things, and they at first didn't really seem to, they obviously didn't see their work as being design history in any way, but I think as our conversations progressed, maybe they did start to see that some of the parallels knit towards the end. So I think it was a similar thing of interviewing people that weren't used to those kind of questions being applied to their work.
I was mostly surprised in my research and oral histories, but by the difference between people who knew they're kind of not completely anonymous because they are the members of staff in a department that is very mediated and very publicized. So they, to some extent, I feel they were like really loyal to the system and to the institution they're part of. And when I talk to students, which are completely anonymous, they had a safe space to, you know, spill the tea and be like, to say whatever they want. And one of them said that it felt like therapy. So I was just more surprised at how people want to share. And it's like, I wish we could interview everyone in the world and just like about anything, because the amount of information one person keeps is just amazing.
No, that's really interesting, like how, as you say, different perspectives are so individual and unique that, you know, it's their story to tell, really. Carol McNeil asks, do you think that many designer fashion houses, self-titled brand names, Vivienne Westwood, Zaha Hadid, architects, etc., contribute to this false idea of the history as a sculpted by individual designers rather than collaborations? Or is it just a natural way of stamping your identity?
That's an amazing question. It's interesting because one of the students that I interviewed for my dissertation said that he really want to have a brand, but he doesn't want it to be under his name because it's not important for him for it to be under his name. He just wanna have his creation, and he just graduated. And I think this is an approach that is fairly new. You can see it in fashion. I cannot talk about architecture because I really don't know anything about it, but in fashion you can really see a movement in Western fashion, which is kind of in the blame for all those brands. You can see a movement of people trying to be like more collaborative and not necessarily have a person's name on their identity. Though this bubble is sometimes breaking. There is an example from Vêtements, which were kind of broken up, and then their designer went to design for Balenciaga and became super famous. But I do think there is a movement in young designers to kind of break this thing about the designer's name. And I definitely do think that this culture, which the first fashion designer, Charles Frederick Worth, has started, of writing your name on everything, is a big part of this canonical history of fashion designers.
So what I would say is, yeah, it's an amazing question. And so lately I've been also seeing that, you know, a lot of young architecture studios which are coming up, they are not under their own name. It's like a collaborative of 2-3 people, and they set up, you know, it's a general name, it's a brand name, but it's not necessarily their name. I would actually like to respond to, like, you know, is this just a natural way of stamping your identity? I think to some extent, yes, definitely it is, because in architectural practice, so I've been reading about it, and, you know, the current day model of studio architectural practice, it actually stems from, you know, an apprenticeship model where there's a master craftsman, and it has descended from there. And that's why I think it went on for quite some time. So I think it has been a natural way of stamping your identity, but things are in flux and things are changing. And there are some people who head studios, like who have founded studios, but which are not under their name. So I think it's something to think more on, and it's in flux.
Eve, I'd be really interested in hearing from you about this, because obviously, as somebody who studies pop memorabilia, you're looking at something that's been not necessarily designed by a band, but is very, you know, band kind of central, and the identity is to the band, not necessarily to the design of the product. So how do you kind of address that in your work?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question that maybe is quite different for the kind of objects that I look at, because the objects that I study are these kind of quite ephemeral pieces of memorabilia. They often don't have a known designer. They are mass produced. They aren't really. There's no identity stamped from the designer themselves, perhaps, or not often. And as you say, instead, it's really to do with the band or the singer, or really representing your fandom and passion for that person. So I suppose, I think it's just very different in that sense. I don't think there is a problem in terms of the designer being kind of isolated, but I think it's perhaps still a similar question in terms of the performer being kind of isolated as the main cultural producer in these stories, and the people that are kind of making fan art or exchanging fan art, or doing graffiti or making t-shirts, all of those kind of things are not as much written about, despite the fact that these are the people that make that make that performer famous, really, and make them as culturally significant as they are. So maybe it's not so much to do with the designer in the case of the things I study, but the performer.
I'm sorry, I'd just like to add one thing. I missed saying one thing. About a question about natural way of stamping your identity. I think it's not just the individual designer, it's how we represent it. The representation is a key aspect, because the representation is choosing to focus on the name. I mean, that this is like one way to look at it. Definitely this is not the whole story, but if one day the representation changes and starts looking at it in a different way, maybe how architects and designers establish their studios will also change. Because for the longest time we have documented practices by focusing on single designers and architects. That's why I think if somebody has to make their name, they need to get in the system. It's about survival as well. So, and like one can survive and thrive more by being in the mainstream. So I think it's like a mix of a lot of complicated factors, which is not only dependent on the individual designer.
No, that's really good. And that actually leads really well into our last question from Catherine, who says, how has studying at the V&A and access to the collections that are affected by the perceptions of global bring us back to this way of presenting research? And how do the big museums, especially, how do you kind of not challenge but work towards talking about missing perspectives from those who do curate their collections in very kind of country-centric ways?
I have an example that I like to give for misrepresenting cultures in the V&A. This long line where James was talking about imagining the V&A, this long line, you go to the National Library and you have the stained glasses windows, which are huge and beautiful and Christian. And then you have other religions, such as Judaism, in those boxes. And in the box, there is a mezuzah, which is something that you put on your door. It's for blessings and good luck. And I don't know, I'm not religious, but it is something you put on your door. And it's on a shelf. And every time I would walk there, I would think, why the glass stained windows are on the window, but the mezuzah is on a shelf and not on a door? Like you could present it in a box on a door, and that would be how it is really supposed to be, how it is curated in a space, in an actual space. And I think part of the missing perspectives in museums is just trying to fake the curatorial space instead of using what we already have in our everyday life And in that way, we are missing a lot of perspectives.
Yeah, I really like that example that Yarden gives, and I think something I've been thinking about a bit is kind of the difference between missing objects in a museum, you know, missing material, and like missing actual perspectives. You know, I think that there is kind of sometimes a bit of a misunderstanding or a blurring of those two ideas, that, you know, if we bring in material that represents you know, a certain country, a certain community, something like that, and display it, that's kind of working towards balancing out missing perspectives. Whereas, you know, as Yarden says, it's more complicated than just having that material included, just like, you know, putting it in a box. You know, it's to do with actually translating the perspective and the culture, and I think maybe that's something that that does get missed. Even if that material is there, it can be kind of not fully followed through, maybe.
Yeah, sometimes even, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I just want to add to Eve that sometimes having the material is adding to the missing perspective more than not having the material, in terms of decolonization and looting in some cases.
Yeah, so I do agree on some points with you both, but I think when it comes to a museum and when it comes to an institutional perspective, a museum like the V&A, I think all the curators are quite well aware that they are missing these kind of perspectives. But in an institution to execute, there is so much, you know, there's so much bureaucracy, and there is so much, like, the time scale of things is so huge. I think like, I don't have a lot of experience, but like, I have worked on one big large scale museum project in India, and you know, it's a 5-6 year project, and in those 5-6 years, you know, the world is changing like this. Like, nowadays it is changing every day, and a decision you take, suppose, you know, in year 1, it may not be relevant by year 3 when you are on the execution stage. So I think these kind of problems are quite, I mean, we miss perspectives because of that. But I think it's like the real world is not perfect, but I think it's about these aspects, these very real practical aspects as well. And also to the fact that, you know, I think this is the first time I'll disagree with Yarden on something, but I'll just, like, not completely disagree, but I think in a museum, you know, when we are bringing real life objects, it's a real time experience we are trying to create through an exhibition. But a core of the exhibition, you know, I'm talking about, again, from a very, I think over here I'm not speaking as a design historian. I'm probably speaking like my parents, who have no idea about this, and they're just going to enjoy an exhibition. And you know, it's like, it's an experience, and which they want to enjoy. And so a bit of element of theatricality, and a bit of that, you know, fakeness, quote unquote fakeness, might actually help attract more visitors. So here we are missing a perspective. Yes, I totally agree on that. But that missing that perspective is maybe at the cost of attracting more visitors. This, again, yeah, I think it's a very weird thing. I don't think there's any balance. But this is my take on this.
No, that's wonderful. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you, all of you, for answering those questions so diligently. And thank you to the audience for joining us. We have another 2 panels tomorrow discussing intersecting spaces and public practices. And all of the details can be found on our website, which will be linked in the chat. And for me, this has just highlighted, like, how we can question our own privilege and our point of view, and ensure to question it and be aware of the stories we aren't telling within our research, and having different ways and methodologies to find out those things. So thank you very much. It's been really eye-opening. Yes. Thank you very much for everyone to attend.
Thank you, Tony, so much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
See you all. Bye.
Yes.